Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for Livestock Guardian Dog webinar series again. I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board real quick. They're responsible for providing the funding for my position and helping us out with support for this program. Our interim director, Dr. Reed Redden, and also Robert Pritz for helping us put the webinars on each month. Really appreciate their support. Our sponsor this month is Lone Star Tracking. If you have any needs for GPS tracking, please contact Lone Star Tracking and talk to Thomas Remark. He's very helpful with getting producers set up for GPS tracking. Just one quick housekeeping thing. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and post those in the question box. We'll try to answer all of those questions at the end of the program. And this week, or this month, we also have our presenter, Dr. Saleh, back again. She's now with Texas A&M, and she's a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Veterinary Pathobiology at the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. She also serves as a project leader for the National Center for Veterinary Parasitology. In 2019, she completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship focused on ticks, their geographic distribution, and tick-borne diseases at Oklahoma State University. She's originally from East Tennessee. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science from the University of Tennessee in 2011 and her PhD in Veterinary Parasitology from Virginia Tech in 2017. Dr. Saleh enjoys teaching students and is an active member of the American Association for Veterinary Parasitologists. In her spare time, she enjoys spending time with her fiance, Chris, and their 2 dogs, Blue and Bella. Also exploring natural parks and bird watching. And so, Dr. Saleh, thank you again for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming back again for this webinar. And so with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. As Bill said, I'm Dr. Saleh. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at Texas A&M. Just moved here the beginning of January. It's my 3rd week on the job, but I'd already committed to this and I really enjoyed last month's webinar, or 2 months ago. So I'm happy to talk to you all again about some intestinal parasites of livestock guardian dogs. Bill already went through this in my introduction, but I'm happy to be back in the SEC. I'm originally from East Tennessee, went to the University of Tennessee, grew up loving the Vols. Hope no one holds that against me, but now I'm a proud Aggie, I promise. At Virginia Tech, I studied Giardia in dogs and cats, which is an intestinal protozoa that has some zoonotic significance. And then I moved on to Oklahoma State, where, as Bill mentioned, I studied ticks and tick-borne disease. And now here I am at Texas A&M, really excited to be here and do some new research projects and hopefully work with Bill and the AgriLife Center to look at some parasites in livestock guardian dogs down the road. So with that, why do we care about intestinal parasites in dogs? Why is it important to prevent them? So we want to prevent intestinal parasites because they cause direct disease and harm to our pets. And when you add that disease and harm to a working dog, it can really impact their performance. So parasites, depending on the species, and we'll talk about the different parasite types, some of them feed on blood, some of them absorb nutrients from the gut intestine, some of them actually feed on tissue, and that's going to cause things like anemia, which is blood loss, or some weight loss. It's going to damage that intestinal tissue, that lining, and they're not going to be able to absorb nutrients as well from when they're feeding and eating. And it's also going to cause diarrhea, which is that loss of fluid will cause dehydration. So a dog that's anemic, losing weight, and dehydrated is not going to be as active. It's not going to be as engaged. It's going to be more lethargic and not doing its job as well as it should be. There's also subclinical effects from parasitism. So you might not notice that there's anemia. There might not be blood in the stool, but over time, these subclinical effects and that damaged mucosa will lead to susceptibility to other diseases, such as bacterial infections or other enteritis or GI upset. And it's just a source point to introduce more pathogens. So we really want to keep parasites in check. There's also zoonotic parasites that dogs can have, which means they can be transmitted from the dogs to people. And some of the zoonotic parasites are kind of no big deal. It's gross if you get it, but it's not super harmful. But some of them are very harmful to people and cause serious disease. And then particularly for livestock guardian dogs, there are parasites that cycle between either sheep or cattle and dogs. And if your cattle or sheep are infected with the intermediate stages of these parasites, it can lead to carcass condemnation, and there's increased parasite transmission between your herd or flock and the dogs. And the last thing you want is your livestock guardian dog contributing to parasites in your livestock that lead to carcass condemnation, and then there's some economic loss associated. So we have health of the dog, parasite transmission, health of the humans or anyone in contact with the dogs, and then also livestock health, food safety health. Those are all really important reasons why we care about preventing intestinal parasites in our dogs. And these images are just to show you some ways you might see some effects of parasitism. So a dog's mucous membranes, if you look at the gum and inside of the mouth, should be really bright pink or red. This is the capillary bed. It's showing you how much blood is present. So an anemic animal is going to have really pale gums. So that's one way you can see if your dog has anemia. Also, this is called melena. And what this is really gross, and I apologize, but it's after lunch, so I felt like it was fair game. Really dark, tarry stool, where the parasites are causing bleeding in the intestine, and this digested blood comes out looking like this dark, tarry material. So if you see that your dog is anemic, or you see a lot of blood in the stool, I would encourage you to, get your dog checked out or take a sample to your veterinarian, work with your veterinarian to deworm the dog, to try and nip the parasites in the bud. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. And if any of you are sheep producers, this is probably reminiscent of FAMACHA scoring when you're looking at mucous membranes for anemia. So these are just some of the common clinical signs from parasites. So what intestinal parasites are commonly infecting our livestock guardian dogs? So there's not a lot of data about livestock guardian dogs and their parasites. And especially in the United States, there's limited data, which is why I'm interested in looking at it down the road in a little bit. But in Switzerland, there's been quite a bit of work looking at the intestinal parasites of livestock guardian dogs. And the most common parasites found were hookworms, roundworms, and whipworms. So I've listed the common name of the parasite and then the scientific name or genus, but I'll try to use the common name throughout because I feel like everyone's probably heard of roundworms or whipworms. So I want to make sure, but if you have questions, feel free to type them in the question box. So they found these were the most common parasites, but they also found some other less common protozoa or tapeworm eggs, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, but I just want to focus on the common intestinal parasites. So remember, it's hookworms, roundworms, and whipworms that we have found in our livestock guardian dogs. Now, when you look at pet dogs, just any pet dog or a shelter dog or a stray dog, the most common parasites that infect those dogs are the exact same three: hookworms, roundworms, and whipworms. So these are what we parasitologists commonly refer to as the big three. They're the most common parasites in our companion animals. They're of the greatest concern. They're the ones we're worried about. So it's not too surprising that livestock guardian dogs are also infected with the same parasites, but it was good to know. So this is a recent study looking at dogs that go to dog parks with their owners. And you can see on the graph, they broke the dogs up into different age groups. So less than 1 year, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 6 years, and greater than or equal to 7 years. And this the darkest bar is our hookworm. So in dogs under a year of age, almost 10% of all the dogs were positive for hookworm. And as the dogs got older, they had less hookworm. They had less of all the parasites. So depending on the age of the dog, about 5 to 10% are infected with hookworms. For whipworms, it ranges from about 1 to 4%. And then our ascarids or roundworms, it goes from less than 1%, 0.5%, up to 3%. But you don't see roundworms as commonly in older dogs as you do younger dogs. And these are dogs that go to the dog park with their owner. They did a survey looking at routine veterinary care as well. So this is kind of our bare minimum estimate. This is our baseline. This is at least what your average pet dog in the United States has. So about 10% of all the dogs that are owned in the US minimum have parasites. So this is just a good baseline to compare because we don't have good data for livestock guardian dogs in the US. So let's talk more about these big three, the big three parasites. So the most common ones, again, are hookworms, roundworms, and whipworms. Hookworms and roundworms, they're pictured here. They live in the small intestine of the dog, and whipworms live in the large intestine. Roundworms are going to be our largest. They're really thick, robust worms, and they can be up to a foot long. Whipworms are more like 3 or 4 inches, and they have a thicker end and a skinnier end. And then hookworms are pretty small. They are about the size of a penny. They're measured in millimeters rather than inches. And we'll look more closely at these and we'll go through the life cycles. But this is just a nice comparison showing you the different worms. And here, if you follow my cursor, this is a hookworm, this is a hookworm, and there's a hookworm. So they're really tiny in comparison. So how do dogs get hookworm? Hookworm life cycle is shown here, and I will walk you all through it. So as I mentioned, the adult hookworms live in the small intestine of the dog. So this little infographic is showing the hookworm, and it's attached to the mucosa or the inner layer of the intestine. And you can see where the worm is attached. They've drawn in blood, and there's these other little spots of blood. That's because hookworms are voracious bloodsuckers. They attach to the mucosa and the lining, and they suck blood. So the adults live in the small intestine, and they are they're producing eggs while they're eating and growing and living in the small intestine. So the eggs are being produced and shed by the females. So the eggs pass in the feces out into the environment. And then it takes about 2 weeks, depending on the environmental conditions, but it can be a little bit faster or slower. If it's warmer and nice and humid, these eggs will larvate, which is where the embryo inside the egg becomes a little larvae, a little baby worm. And then eventually the larvae will hatch out of the egg and be in the environment. So it's in the soil, it's in the grass, waiting to get picked up by another dog. And what these larvae can do, again, this takes a couple weeks of development depending on the environmental conditions. They can penetrate the skin of the dog. So they can penetrate through the skin. They worm their way through the skin, and they will migrate through the tissue until they can get back to the small intestine and be adults. Or as the dog is in the yard or out in the field, and it's eating something that the larvae are crawling on, or if it's eating grass that have the larvae, it can be infected orally by ingesting the larvae in the environment. And then as the worms move through the normal digestive tract of the dog, they arrive in the small intestine where they become adults and feed on blood all over again. And these are what the eggs look like under the microscope. And then here are the adult male and female worms. You can see how tiny they are next to a US penny. So they're pretty small. You're not going to see these in the feces of the dog. If you see worms in the stool of your dog, it's not going to be hookworms because they're a little small to see with the naked eye. So I mentioned that hookworms are bloodsuckers, and they're called plug feeders because they will grab onto the intestine and suck blood at that site. So this is a small intestine of a dog, and this area right here with all the red around, this is a feeding site with a hookworm attached. So you can see all the blood loss that's associated with the hookworm feeding. And this is a really cool video of hookworms inside the small intestine of a dog. So they fed a dog a little camera capsule, like in a pill, and then it recorded what was going on in the small intestine, and then it passes in the feces. So there's a hookworm adult. And then here's a little feeding lesion. I'm going to play it again so you can orient yourself. There's a worm. Here's another worm. And you can see these dark red spots where the worms have been feeding, and then they move to a new spot. So the worms are attached to the intestine, and they're doing that plug feeding and sucking blood. This is a close-up view of a hookworm. So this is looking right in its face, head on, and they have these cutting teeth. They have 3 teeth on each side, and this is what they use to grab onto that mucosa and suck blood. So this is a tissue section. So we cut through the intestine with the hookworm attached. And so there's the hookworm, and there it is with the host tissue in its mouth. And here's just another view where it's literally gripping the animal intestine in its jaws and just sucking blood that way. So it's a pretty significant blood feeder, and there are very large infections. There can be thousands of worms in the small intestine, and they can bleed puppies dry. It's very sad. So how common is hookworm? I told you that in the first study I showed you that it's about 10% of dogs going to dog parks have hookworms. So what about just your random dog that's not going to the dog park necessarily? So the Companion Animal Parasite Council puts out these parasite prevalence maps based on test results from veterinary clinics. So this is a compilation of data from vet clinics across the country showing how common hookworm is. And across the US, 3% of dogs have hookworm. So that's 1 in 33. And you can see that in the South, hookworm is much more prevalent. And then I know not everyone watching the webinar is in Texas, but I wanted to look at Texas specifically because in Texas, it's as much as 5% or 1 in 20 dogs. Now, again, these are pet dogs who go to the vet routinely. So this is our minimum prevalence. This is the bare minimum as far as number of dogs with parasites, because this doesn't count for dogs that don't go to the vet regularly, dogs that are stray, or dogs that live in animal shelters, or farm dogs who aren't going into the vet, or there's also vet clinics that don't send their data electronically. So there's a lot of gaps in this, but it's a good estimate. It's a good baseline. So hookworm is all over the US, more common in the South and Midwest, but it does happen everywhere. So that's hookworms covered. I'm going to move on to roundworms now. So again, these are our roundworms pictured at the bottom. They're very stout-bodied, large worms. Again, they can be up to a foot long. They're very, very gross and shocking when you see them pass in the feces. It's very jarring when you see these. And they can obstruct an intestine. I mean, this is the width of the small intestine, and this is just 3 or 4 worms. So imagine if there were even more. They can block the entire gut and cause major issues. So roundworms also live in the small intestine. That's where the adults live. So the adults are here in the small intestine, and they will be passing eggs that are then shed in the feces. And the eggs have to develop in the soil. Again, it takes a couple weeks, and they develop a little larvae inside. And unlike hookworms, which hatch out of the larvae or hatch out of the egg, and then the larvae crawls around and tries to either penetrate the skin or be ingested, the larvae stays inside this egg. The dog can be infected by ingesting a developed egg in the soil, or it can ingest a secondary host that has come into contact with the egg and is now a carrier. So there's a couple different ways, but somehow the dog needs to ingest this developed larvated egg, which will then travel to the small intestine, release the larvae, and grow up to be an adult. This is just a mass of roundworms from a dog. It was straining to defecate because there were so many worms. It was very traumatic and unpleasant. And then these are what the eggs look like under the microscope. And they have a really thick shell wall. And this thick shell wall is protective. So these eggs survive for years, months to years in the environment. They're resistant to desiccation. The shell protects them from most common disinfectants. They are persistent for a very long time. So the significance of that, I forgot to mention this, but hookworm eggs are susceptible to freezing. So if there's a good hard freeze, the eggs can die, the larvae will die, excuse me. The egg is protective, but once it's hatched out into a larvae, it's susceptible to extreme temperature fluctuations and can die. But these roundworm eggs are really hardy. So if you have an infected dog that's been in your yard or field, the eggs are going to persist for a long time and can be a source of infection for future dogs. So that's why we stress routine treatment, ideally monthly, and we'll get into treatment a little bit later. But I just wanted to point out that these eggs live a long time in the environment. So let's take a look at roundworms inside the intestine. So again, this is a video of the small intestine, and I think these worms are much easier to see. They are obvious, and look how much of the intestine they're blocking. I mean, they take up a lot of room, and this is just a couple of worms. So it's really significant if you have a large mass of the worms. So again, these are the adults in the small intestine, and this is the same camera capsule that is fed to a dog that's infected, and you can see the worms moving around. And roundworms don't attach the mucosa and feed on blood like hookworms. They live in the lumen, and they will eat nutrients and intake nutrients that are already in the gut. So they're stealing food from the dog. They're not sucking blood. So you can see they're several inches long in this image. Now, how about roundworms? Where are they? How common are they in the US? So in the US, a little less than 2% of dogs that are going to the vet, so about 1 in 32, have roundworms. And roundworms are more common in dogs under 1 year of age. Puppies very commonly are infected with roundworms, and that's because puppies can be infected while they're in utero, before they're born. They can be infected in the placenta during pregnancy. So again, this is our minimum prevalence of just about 2. And this is a characteristic hallmark example of a wormy puppy. It has that really distended, chubby abdomen, and that's all because of roundworms. It's not a fat puppy. You can see the legs are really skinny and the hips, but this distended abdomen is characteristic of a roundworm infection. And I actually am going to back up, so bear with me, because I didn't talk through this transplacental transmission. So the pup can be infected in utero. So the puppies are, the bitch is gestating, has puppies, and the larvae that get ingested from the egg will cross from the small intestine to the placenta and infect the puppies. So the puppies are born with the worms. So it doesn't even matter about the contaminated environment or not. Puppies are often born with whipworms. So it's important, if you have a roundworm problem, to treat prophylactically to make sure you can manage it and keep it from causing a lot of illness or adverse effects in your puppies, because the puppies don't have a lot of reserves or resources to deal with their roundworm infection. So we want to prevent this. All right, the last worm we're going to talk about for now is the whipworm. So whipworms live in the large intestine, and they are bigger than hookworms, but smaller than roundworms. And they're, again, a few inches long, anywhere from 2 to 4 inches. And one end of the worm is really thickened, and the other end is really thin. So this is why they're called whipworm, because they kind of look like a bullwhip, like an Indiana Jones whip, if you will. And in the large intestine, what happens is the really thin end is the anterior end, and it threads down into the mucosa, into the microvilli. So it's actually penetrating into the skin, disrupting the cells, and it's feeding there by being threaded down into the tissue. So again, that's damage to the mucosa. That's an entry point for other pathogens, other bacterial infections that can cause major problems. So the whipworms are in the cecum and colon, which is the large intestine, and the adults are shedding eggs. And the eggs of whipworm look like footballs, in my opinion. They're little lemon-shaped eggs. They're brown. They look like footballs. And they're defecated. The eggs are passed when the dog defecates, and then the egg lives in the environment, and it will larvate inside the egg. And then the dog ingests this larvated egg, again, out in the field. There's no intermediate host. There's no transmission from the bitch to the pup. This is a very direct, simple life cycle. Egg is passed in the feces, the egg larvates, the egg gets ingested, and then there's adults in the large intestine. So it's a very straightforward life cycle. So because the adults live in the large intestine, it causes something called hematochezia, which is when there's frank blood in the feces. So the first image I showed with the melena, where it was the dark, tarry stool of digested blood, because it's in the large intestine, the blood's not going to be digested, and it will just be frank red blood in the feces. So that's a common clinical sign of whipworm infections. And here you can see again the thick and thin end that makes it look like it's a whip. And these are going to be easier to see in the feces than hookworms, but still kind of tricky. And I don't recommend examining your dog's feces for worms. If you see them, it'll be obvious. So if you want to check for parasites, we'll talk about that shortly. I'll tell you guys how you can do that. So whipworms are all over the country, but most common kind of here in the South, and they are in less than 1% of these pet dogs that we have data for from the Companion Animal Parasite Council. So much less common, but they're also underdiagnosed because these worms don't make a lot of eggs. They shed much fewer eggs compared to our hookworms and roundworms. And the way we diagnose parasites in veterinary medicine is we look at the feces, we do a test, and we're looking for the eggs in the feces. So if the worm's not creating a lot of eggs to be in the feces, we're less likely to find the eggs if there are very few there. So that's a complication with our whipworms. Now, a couple other worms that I just want to mention a little more quickly in less detail. There's also tapeworms that can commonly infect both pet dogs and livestock guardian dogs. So there's a few different types, and Diploidium caninum is what's pictured here on the feces. And this is when tapeworms are often when you see the little small grains of rice. It looks like little grains of rice moving around on the feces. Those are tapeworm segments, which we also call proglottids. And tapeworms can be feet long, but generally what's passed in the feces are these individual proglottids. So Diploidium caninum is dogs get it by ingesting a flea. So they eat a flea and then the tapeworm develops in the small intestine. So a good way to prevent Diploidium caninum is to not let your dog eat fleas or to have good flea control. So flea control will help keep parasites like the tapeworm at bay. The other less important, so these are kind of our more benign tapeworms, is Taenia pisiformis. And dogs get this when they prey on rabbits that have the larval stage inside the tissue. So this is a rabbit, and you can see all of these little white bubbles that the green arrows are pointing at. Those are the larval tapeworm stage. So the dog eats a rabbit that has these larval tapeworm stages, and then the adult tapeworm develops in the small intestine of the dog, and then the dog will shed the proglottids or segments that have the tapeworm egg inside. These are common in our companion animals as well, in our pet dogs. Again, flea control will help with the Diploidium tapeworm, and preventing predation of rabbits is how we control Taenia in pet dogs. But for your livestock guardian dogs, that could be pretty tricky to try and keep them from eating rabbits. I know they're not on a leash, you know, they're out in the fields. So that's one we might have to live with or do periodic treatments to keep at bay. Now, the other two tapeworms are less common, Taenia hydatogena and Taenia ovis, and they don't really cause much harm to the dog. They're pretty benign to the dog, but the problem is, especially for sheep, these cause sheep measles, where that larval stage is in the muscle of the sheep, and it can cause carcass condemnation. It's very common in Canada and Australia. It happens in some spots in the US, especially when you get to the border of Canada, kind of in the Midwest or Northwest, but it's not very common. And again, it's not harmful to your dog, to the livestock guardian dog. It's just that if you have an infected dog in the field, it's going to perpetuate the life cycle, and then you're going to have losses down the road because you're going to have carcasses that the USDA inspectors are going to flag and condemn. So the adults live in the small intestine. They're not causing a lot of problems. Those proglottids or tapeworm segments and the eggs are being passed in the feces of the dog. And then just while grazing, the sheep will ingest the eggs. And most livestock aren't going to eat canine feces, but it will rain, the feces will disintegrate, and the eggs will be left behind. And they have a decent shell, so they're pretty well protected. So the sheep eats the eggs and then develops the larval stage in the muscle. And then the way the dog is infected is it ingests the carcass or any offal or viscera from a dead animal, from an infected sheep. And that's how the life cycle perpetuates. So to stop this one, you want to keep the dog from eating any of the dead animals And ideally your dogs don't eat your sheep. That would not be a good livestock guardian dog. But occasionally if one dies from natural causes, or you have some leftover or the viscera, some people might feed that to the dog, and that can perpetuate the life cycle. So I just wanted to mention that one. So how do you know if your livestock guardian dog has parasites? I talked about you can look for anemia. Sometimes it'll be really obvious. There'll be worms passed in the feces. If you happen upon the feces and see the worms in it, you'll know that there's parasites there. But really, to know if there's parasites, you have to do something called fecal flotation to find eggs that are passed in the feces. And it's the most sensitive version of this test uses a centrifuge to spin the feces to help separate the eggs from the debris that's in the feces. We like to say in parasitology that feces is full of crap, literally. So we want to pull the eggs out from the crap so we can look at them under a microscope. So you're going to need your veterinarian's help to do this. You can collect samples. You can collect a fecal sample, in a glove or a baggie, or they can give you specimen cups. And you'll need to give your veterinarian feces from your dog so they can test it for parasites. You can also use a vet school reference lab in your area. I know TVMDL accepts samples. If you're local or in Texas, you could use TVMDL. But you want to work with your veterinarian to test and screen your dogs for parasites. And ideally, you would do this once a year to get a baseline and see what parasites are present. And then if you know your dog is infected with either hookworms, whipworms, or roundworms, then do an appropriate treatment at designated intervals so you can stay on top of it so it's not causing any harm in your dog. So I mentioned the fecal flotation. This is what it looks like. So we're looking at a slide with the parasite fecal flotation on the slide, and we're looking for these eggs. So these are just examples of different parasite eggs. We have our roundworms, our hookworms, whipworms, and these are our two different tapeworm eggs. This is a Diploidium egg packet or a Taenia egg. So you will know if your dog has parasites if you physically see worms in the feces visibly. That is a telltale sign. But otherwise, you're going to have to work with your veterinarian to get a sample and evaluate the dog for parasites. So knowing what we know the life cycle, we know how to check for parasites. How do we prevent intestinal parasites in dogs? So there's two main avenues. One is treatment. So routine treatment, a broad spectrum. Broad spectrum means it treats several different parasites. It's not just one thing. So a tick prevention only does ticks. A flea product only does fleas, but there are broad spectrum products that do fleas, ticks, and some intestinal worms, and maybe heartworm. And not every product gets everything. Just because it gets worms, we need to know, does it get whipworms, roundworms, and hookworms? Or does it get whatever worms were diagnosed in your dog? You want to make sure you're using the right treatment for whatever parasite you have. And the recommendation is that every dog, every month, all year long, should get a routine broad spectrum preventive product. So that's routine treatments at designated intervals to keep the parasites at bay. Because I mentioned the eggs have to develop for a couple weeks in the environment and then they infect the dog. But if you give a product on the first of the month and you kill all the hookworms, whipworms, and roundworms, there's still those eggs and larvae out in the environment where the dog lives and works that can infect the dog. So in 3 or 4 weeks' time, the dog is going to have parasites again. So if you don't treat again in a month, the parasites are going to mature to adults, start sucking blood, stealing nutrients, damaging the mucosa, and impacting the health of your dog, and shed more eggs to further contaminate that environment. So you want to stay on top of it and try to prevent the parasites from ever becoming a problem. For some of our parasites, another way we can prevent them is if we interrupt the life cycle. So interrupting the life cycle depends on the parasite species. So our tapeworms, for example, we can stop the parasite life cycle if we stop the dog from ingesting infected sheep, or if we stop the dog from eating rabbits, or if we stop the dog from having fleas. So you can't go and pick up all the hookworm eggs that are on your field, but you can keep the dog from having fleas or eating sheep carcass, things like that. So again, it depends on the parasites that are of concern and that your dog has. if it's possible to interrupt the life cycle with that environmental management. Some people feed BARF diets, BARF, and it's biologically, it's a raw diet. It's bones and raw food or biologically active replacement food, something like that. And it's raw meat and viscera. And that's not recommended because there's no way to guarantee that that meat and carcass isn't parasite infected. So raw diets, if you're trying to manage parasites, are not a good idea. So that optimal control comes from routine monthly treatments with an approved product. And probably a lot of you are here because there's lots and lots of product options. There's combination products that only treat some worms or a couple worms. There's products that treat some intestinal worms and also heartworm, or also flea and tick control. So the best way and the best product is the product that will treat the parasites you have and that you'll give to your dog. So you have to work with your veterinarian to know what parasites are present so you can use the right product. If you go and buy something at Petco or PetSmart or Tractor Supply, even if it's a good product that I have listed on the next slide, if your dog has whipworms and that product doesn't treat whipworms, it's useless. It's not going to help with that parasite. So that's really important to know what you're starting with, check your labels, and work with your veterinarian. So I have a summary chart and then some other slides just going through some common prevention products and talking about what they treat and control. And then I know I'm getting close on time, and then we'll stop and take questions. So this chart of monthly parasite control products for dogs. So I have the ingredients. So this is the drug listed on the left. And then in the next column is the brand name. There are more. This is not a complete list. The font would be teeny tiny. We would not be able to read it if I tried to include every single product that exists. But these are the common brand names listed here. And then this is how you give it. And this, I apologize, this should say topical. So most of these are oral products, so you can mix them in with the food, but this bottom row is a topical product right here. And then I have listed if it gets heartworm, fleas, ticks, hookworms, roundworms, whipworms, or tapeworms. And if there's an X in the box, then it will treat that parasite. So this is a good summary chart, and I know this replay will be available if you want to spend some time studying this. But I'll go through the products as well, and then I'll talk to Bill about a way to distribute this or post it somewhere so it's available, and I'll fix that little error. So again, these are the ingredients. So if you find a product or you have a product that's not on this list, but it contains ivermectin and pyrantel pamoate, then you know it will treat heartworms, hookworms, and roundworms. And when I say treat heartworms, I mean prevent heartworms, prevent infection. If you have a product that is milbemycin oxime, then you know it's a heartworm prevention. It will treat hookworms, roundworms, and whipworms. Now, if we add another ingredient, such as lufenuron or spinosad, then it also is going to treat fleas. So we get our intestinal parasite control plus heartworm and fleas. Now, tapeworms require a special drug called praziquantel. So you'll see that only a few of the drugs, or only a few of the products, get tapeworms, and they're the ones that contain praziquantel here. So it's a trade-off. If you have a problem with tinea in your area, or if you live somewhere where tinea ovis or tinea hydatidina, those sheep measles tinea are a problem, and that's an issue for your farm, you definitely want to consider using a product that will treat those tapeworms and will interrupt that life cycle. If you have whipworms in your dog, you don't have as many choices. There's fewer products that treat whipworms in a combination than roundworms or hookworms. So you have to take that into account. So this first row, ivermectin and pyrantel pamoate. So these are some examples: HeartGuard Plus, Iverheart Plus, TriHeart Plus. And these prevent hookworm infection and also will treat hookworms and roundworms. And this is an oral tablet that you give monthly to your dog. Ivermectin plus pyrantel pamoate plus praziquantel. Now that we have the praziquantel in there, this will also treat tapeworms. So if you have a tapeworm issue or live in an area where there's a lot of tapeworm, sheep measles tapeworm, then you want to consider using a product with praziquantel. And it will say on the box, it will have information on the front of the box showing what it treats. So this is heartworm defense, and it gets roundworms, hookworms, tapeworms. So it will tell you, it has to be on the box. So just check out the box and see what it says. Now, milbemycin oxime is a different ingredient, and you might see it as Interceptor or Milbegard. But you see there's the brand name, and then underneath it will have the ingredient or the drug. So milbemycin oxime. And it will say the weight of the animals that it's approved for. And it will say, you know, it's for the prevention of heartworm disease. It treats hookworms, roundworms, and also gets whipworms. So that's how you can look at a label or a product box and see what it actually treats. I just wanted to go through some examples of that. So you guys are a little better equipped to decide what product is best for your dog. And again, working with your vet or a diagnostic lab to test the dogs for parasites is the best way to know what product to use. So yeah, with that, oh, here's another good link that has parasite product information, capcvet.org. If you just write down or remember that part and go to their website, they have parasite product charts, and you can compare different products or see what treats ticks, what treats fleas, what does ticks and fleas and heartworm, or what only does whipworms. Maybe you only need to treat for whipworms, so you can look for a whipworm only product. So with that, thank you guys for your attention and for joining us today. And I'm happy to take any questions. Bill, if you want to, I don't know if we got any in the chat. I'll stop the screen share though, so we can do any questions.
We do. We have quite a few in the chat today. Oh, thank you again, Dr. Saleh, for doing that presentation. I really like those videos with the worms actually alive in the intestines. They're
pretty crazy. Cool. They're pretty cool. Yeah. I'm glad you liked them.
So the first question we had is, it says that she just lost an alpaca to barber pole worm, and she wants to know for LGD, since the dog is with them, if the dog could also be infected.
Yes, that's a great question. Luckily, barber pole homunculus does not infect dogs. So sadly, I'm very sorry you lost an alpaca. It's a bloodsucker and it's really bad for sheep and goats. But no, your dogs will not be infected. They're not contributing to the life cycle. They don't share parasites in that way. So your dogs are going to be safe from barber pole for sure.
Another question, what if a dog eats the sheep's placenta? Are they going to be able to get, you know, roundworms or other kind of worms from that?
Yeah, so the worms I talked about cannot be passed in the sheep placenta, but there are other parasites. Neospora caninum can be, dogs can get that from eating placenta. But if you have Neospora on your farm in sheep, you're going to have problems like early term abortion, neurologic signs. Like you'll probably be aware that won't be the first incidence that your dog gets Neospora from the sheep placenta. So not common parasites, if that helps. None of the worms I talked about, it's a really rare protozoa, but it is possible.
The next one is, she was told that her goats are a carrier of the barber pole worm, and she read that there's a vaccine out in Canada and Australia, but not here. Is that?
Yeah, that is accurate. And so I did my PhD on Giardia, but my advisor, actually Dr. Redden knows her, Ann Zajac, is in the Small Ruminant Consortium, or she used to be. So we did a lot of homunculus research as well. The vaccine is not available in the United States yet. It's called BarberVax, I'm pretty sure is the name of it. And hopefully it will be available here soon. And again, that's a completely different blood-sucking parasite than the dogs. And I don't know a good timeline for when it should be available. Is Dr. Redden on here? Does he have some insight in the vaccine? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, okay. I'm here.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we'd love to have all the tools in the toolbox. Unfortunately, that may not be as good a tool as we might think, because it's kind of a primer vaccine that requires 2 to 3 treatments, 2 to 3 weeks apart, and they need to be a month before that parasite season comes. And so it has some efficacy, but there's a lot of things that have to go right to get it to work. There may be some other options, some other pharmaceutical products that are labeled internationally that would be more help faster. And there's some new like things out now with like probiotics. It's kind of like a
Oh, the
probiotic in the
Bacillus
soil.
thuringius. Yes, there's
Yeah.
some really great stuff
Well, there's a lot
coming.
of other things out there that may help with internal parasites in sheep and goats, but that's a bit distracting from the topic of this today. So there's a whole bunch of other questions you need to get to. So I'm not going to
Yes.
take up any more time
Sorry.
through them. But yeah.
Okay. Is HeartGuard considered broad spectrum? Sorry, Bill, I
Oh,
found
the
them.
next question is, okay.
No, this,
The next question, go ahead, doctor.
okay. HeartGuard is not considered broad spectrum. HeartGuard on its own is only a heartworm prevention, and it's a good heartworm prevention. But if you have HeartGuard Plus, then it's broad spectrum and gets those other parasites. And sorry, Bill, you can read the questions if that's
No,
better.
go ahead.
Okay.
If you've got them,
Yeah.
feel free.
It took me a minute to find them. So HeartGuard Plus is what you want to look for to get broad spectrum. So the next question is about giving a livestock guardian dog ivermectin for cattle at a dosage determined by their veterinarian. Should the dog be tested for the MDR1 mutation? So the MDR1 mutation is a mutation that some breeds have that makes them susceptible to ivermectin toxicity, and it's in collie breeds. This is something you should talk to your veterinarian about, but if the veterinarian gave you the dosage, they are keeping that in mind. They know about this mutation and it should be safe. But this is one of the reasons why it's not recommended to use something like Ivomec off label for the dog. So it depends on the breed of your livestock guardian dog, and definitely your veterinarian. Everyone in vet school learns about this, will be aware of it, and I would talk to them about it. But generally, if a veterinarian gave you the dose, it'll be at the safe dose. So even dogs with the MDR1 mutation can get ivermectin prevention, the labeled for dogs, because it's at a safe dose. But you do want to be really careful not to accidentally overdose the dog, just in case. So what does HeartGuard Plus, the ivermectin pyrantel, treat for on a monthly basis? So what that ivermectin is doing is it is stopping any heartworm. So heartworm is transmitted by mosquitoes. So mosquitoes feed on your dog and give tiny larvae that become adult heartworm. If any larvae get injected into the dog from a mosquito, it kills those before they can be adult heartworms. So that's why it's called heartworm prevention, because it prevents the heartworm disease by killing the larvae before they can grow up. The pyrantel is going to get the hookworms and roundworms. So if there are any hookworms or roundworms in the dog intestine, it's at a high enough dose, it will kill those adult worms. So that's what it's treating for on a monthly basis. And because the life cycle can happen in 2 weeks and the eggs are already in the environment, that's why we do it monthly over and over again, because they can get infected in between treatments. Nadine asked about an injectable prevention. There is an injectable heartworm prevention called ProHeart 6 or ProHeart 12. And I didn't include it on my chart because it's a heartworm prevention. And when the dog gets the injection, so if your dog got it today, it will kill any hookworms that your dog has today. But it doesn't kill hookworms for the next 6 months or 12 months. So it's broad spectrum in that it gets hookworms and heartworms at the time of injection, but they haven't worked out getting the part that kills intestinal worms to be slow release long-term. So there is an injectable. If you live in a heartworm endemic area, it is definitely worth doing. But just know you're not going to get intestinal prevention long-term. The likelihood of a person picking up hooks from the ground where an infected dog has been. If you're wearing shoes, you're totally safe. The larvae can't get through your shoes. But the hookworm larvae can penetrate the skin of people, and it is a zoonotic concern. It's something called cutaneous larval migrans, and cutaneous because the larvae get under your skin. It depends on the prevalence in your area. It's much more common in the Gulf Coast and southern US. And again, you'd have to be going barefoot or like on a beach. Beaches in Florida, people will be in like wet sandy areas and sitting on the sand in their bathing suit without a towel. They can get cutaneous larval migrans on their rear and legs, And you always see local news stories about it after people go to the beach. So it's slim if you're wearing shoes, but it's another reason to make sure your dog is up on prevention. Possibility to get resistance to the dewormers. It's another great question. Sadly, there is some resistance to intestinal parasites in dogs. There's some hookworms that are resistant to our dewormers, mainly seen in racing greyhounds. So greyhounds, the racing industry in Florida was closed because of regulations. And so a lot of those greyhounds were adopted out to other parts of the country, and they have a resistant strain of hookworm. So it is possible, which is why it's important to use your dewormers effectively and consulting with your veterinarian, and why you want to test a couple times, not just once and then keep giving the same prevention. Ideally, you're testing again to see if that dewormer worked. Anything transmissible from squirrels. Not that I know of, not that's routine for dogs or cats. It's mostly livestock and rabbits. And then for cats, rodents will, Taenia teniiformis is the tapeworm that cats get from eating rodents and rats, but not from squirrels. Back to the chart, treat or prevent. Oh, I started on prevention and then I switched to treat. So heartworm is called, it's a can of worms, if you'll pardon the parasitology pun. So heartworm is a prevention. None of the drugs listed on the chart treat heartworm. They prevent heartworm by killing the larvae before they become adults. For all of the intestinal parasites, it's a treatment. It means the worms are in the intestines, and when you give this monthly product, it treats and kills the adult worms. I hope that helped, Renee. Sorry for that switch in vernacular. And Andrea asked a really good question. Is it advisable to heartworm test before treating your dog? Yes, you definitely want to test your dog for heartworm before you begin treatment or a monthly preventive even. It's good to know that heartworm status. And if you have a puppy or a dog less than 6 months of age and you start them on a heartworm prevention, you can delay testing because it takes 6 months from when that mosquito bites before there's an adult heartworm. So if you start your prevention and you use it routinely like you're supposed to, or not like you're supposed to, but as labeled, then you can delay the testing. But pet dogs, it's recommended, well, for any dog, that they are tested once a year, even if they're on their prevention routinely, because there is some resistance to heartworm prevention. And sometimes you forget a dose, you just never know. So it is good you should test before you treat. Let's see, the DNA testing can be done for Embark and Wisdom. I'm not sure what that's about. I'm so sorry. The next question is, at what temperature do fleas go dormant? Do I need to give my livestock guardian dog Canine Advantix 2 year round, or can I stop during the cold months? Deborah, do you mind to type in where you're located? It would depend on where you're located, and the temperature varies. And just because there's 2 days with in DC, okay, where there's a really deep freeze, it might not be enough to kill the fleas because the pupa are environmentally resistant to a lot of change, and humidity is more of a factor for fleas. Also, fleas live on the dog, so they're not affected by freezing temperatures. They're on the body of the dog, so they're getting that kind of microclimate, and then the fleas are going to be laying eggs that fall off the dog. And so often the flea stages that are in the environment are more in the bedding or in areas that are close to buildings. So they're kind of insulated and protected. So I would not stop flea control during the cold months. I would continue it year round, especially with those temperature spikes. And thank you, Stephanie. Sorry that I didn't understand that. If you have a concern about MDR1 testing in a collie breed, you can do that through the companies called Embark and Wisdom. Thank you for sharing that. And then a SNAP test. What does a SNAP test look for? You may have heard your veterinarian talk about using a SNAP test. This is a really cool antigen test that IDEXX has created, and there are other versions of antigen tests out there, but SNAP test is specific to IDEXX. And it depends on what you're testing for. So if you're testing for heartworm, the SNAP test is looking for antigen, which is protein released by the female heartworms living in the dog's heart. If it's a tick-borne disease SNAP test, the 40X, then it's looking for antibodies to Lyme disease bacteria or anaplasma or Ehrlichia. And antibodies are the things your dog will produce in response to that pathogen infection. There's also SNAP tests for parvovirus. There's SNAP tests for a feline leukemia virus. So it just depends on what the test is, but generally it's looking for a protein either from the pathogen or an antibody that the dog made in response to the pathogen. Chris has a great question about testing heartworm timing. If it takes 6 months for heartworms to show up, what if you test negative and then you're treating, but they actually had it? So if my dog is tested today and she's never been on prevention, I just adopted her from a shelter, and she's negative today. So I say, okay, it's good to go. I can start my prevention. So when you say then treat, this is where you actually start a heartworm prevention. So she's on her heartworm prevention every month, and then next year she turns up positive. Then what you know is that she was infected in the 6 months prior to the test. So that does happen, and that's why we test annually. So we are asking what happens. I guess it would just depend on the clinical case, but especially with stray dogs or shelter dogs, older dogs that are being adopted, this can happen. It's called the pre-patent period, and it's the time before you can detect the infection. Oh, is it harmful? I'm so sorry that you're going to hate this answer. It depends, Chris. If it's already happened and your dog is fine, don't worry. The veterinarian will treat the adult heartworm infection and do all the workup that you need to do. But you want to start the prevention right away. You don't want to test today and say, well, maybe it's positive and it just hasn't been enough time. Let's test later. Because in that time that you're waiting, it can accumulate heartworm from the environment now. So it's better to test and start prevention than wait. And that is just a risk or a caveat that goes along with it. And actually in my lab here at Texas A&M, we're working on early heartworm detection so we can find it sooner than 6 months to help with that exact problem, because it's really frustrating. That's 6 months is a long time. So happy to help. Any other questions? Or Bill, I know we're really close on time. If I can help with anything.
I think we're doing okay. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. If you could please post those real quick.
Yeah, I can hang on for a few minutes and see if more come in.
But at some point, yeah, that chart that you posted and some of that other information, if you wouldn't mind sending me a few of those, and I can get those posted for us. And
yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Questions, get that sent out. So
okay. Stephanie asked if I could do a talk on Giardia. Does Stephanie know me? I love Giardia because I did my PhD on it. That makes me so happy. I could, but I don't think it pertains to livestock guardian dogs as much. So shoot me an email, Stephanie. I'll make sure my email address is included. And if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I don't know. I guess if we survey the dogs down the road and find it, then maybe, yes, we should talk about it. Oh, hunting dogs. Okay. It's not a huge problem for hunting dogs. But yeah, I'll give it some thought and see if I can work it into a future presentation with Bill. A
couple last questions. Somebody wanted to know if you were going to be posting the slides. They'll be in the video presentation, so you'll be able to check that out. And then there was something about soils, Doctor.
Okay, and I'll give Bill a version of the slides that can be posted as a PDF. That's my fault. I didn't do that ahead of time. Can you treat the soil for the parasites? You can technically, but the only way to kill whipworm eggs is to burn them. So no, please do not do that. Do not light your yard on fire to kill the eggs. So it's very difficult to treat the soil. There's not anything good that you can spray or apply for the eggs. It's very frustrating. So the dogs and deer have different Giardia. So your dog's not actually going to get Giardia from eating deer feces, but if they do eat deer feces, they probably eat all kinds of other stuff and drink pond water or stream water. And there could be Giardia cysts there, but it's not directly from the deer, luckily. So.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That was fantastic.
Oh, glad you liked it. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm happy to do it. I really appreciate all the great questions and attention. I'll get the slides to Bill as soon as this is done. I do apologize for not having those ahead of time. You cannot get ProHeart 6 over the counter. You can, but you have to get the prescription from your vet. So you could buy it at Petco or PetSmart, but they have to have the prescription from the vet. Oh, not for ProHeart 6 because it's injectable. Only the vet can do the injectable preventive. If you want to get a different heartworm prevention that's like a topical or oral, they'll have to, send in saying, yes, they're negative. There is a heartworm test. It's only prescription. So hope that helps.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. It's 4 o'clock. Thank you again, everybody, for logging in. Again, thank you, Dr. Saleh, for another great presentation, and Dr. Redden and Robert for their support. If you're looking for another Livestock Guardian Dog webinar, we'll have another one in March. That'll be on Livestock Guardian Dog Nutrition with Dr. Zoran from Texas A&M University also. So thank you guys again very much, and everybody have a good day.